What a brilliant end to that part of the song. Just the band was like, you know what? There's important shit that needs to be said. Well, everybody, welcome. My name is Jo Hofberg, and I have the pleasure of speaking with the brilliant and the ever so generous Grey Armstrong. And today we are going to be speaking about his second article about Lindy Hop and Blackness, which is an 8-part series discussing race, specifically Blackness in the Lindy Hop community. In the first part of the series, we looked at the Black experience in the Lindy Hop community today. And the question that started the whole series was, how did we get here? How did we get to a point where so many Black people feel alienated from their own heritage? So, welcome, Grey Armstrong! Yay! Everybody out in the internets, clap your hands.
I feel like I'm on Oprah.
I am honored. I am honored. So great. Let's make sure that you are properly introduced. What should all of the fabulous people watching know about you? Like, how do we want to express all of your amazing accolades in a short amount of time? I know. Right? Which is why I'm having you do this.
Let's go. So, I've got it. No. Okay, cool. My name is Grey Armstrong. I am a dance instructor and writer who lives in Denver, Colorado. I've been dancing for, I guess, almost a decade, somewhere around there now at this point. Started with Lindy Hop, and now I primarily dance and teach blues. And I have a blog named Obsidian Tea that started as a blog for my additional content for my classes and has then switched into exploring culture, anti-racism, being active in your community, and just history overall. So when I was contacted by the iLindy team to work together to collaborate, we kind of came up with this idea of the series of, let's talk about Lindy Hop and Blackness. And one of the things while I was kind of drafting some ideas about it was the question of how did we get here? You know, how did we get here? And I thought, the thing that kills me is I thought I knew. You know, I knew enough history that I thought, like, I have a general understanding, you know, racism happened and now the scene is white, and that's what happened.
I like how you package that very neatly right there. Like, racism happened and now the scene is white. Ta-da!
Ta-da! And that was kind of
the same one. I got the same memo. So yeah.
That was kind of the gist of what I thought the answer was going to be. Yeah. And then I started reading. And then I started reading some more. And the hole got deeper. And it got deeper. And that's how I ended up with a 10,000 word article that you can read on the site.
It's a bit of a beast, but goddamn, is it informative. It was so fun to read, Greg, because I was like, oh yeah, okay, I can see my history, or like the information I had kind of converge, where it's like, yeah, that's the one I'm a little bit more versed in, or like those are the milestones that were part of my education, versus like, oh yeah, there was more to that story. Okay, so it was surprising to you too.
Oh yeah, so surprising. I knew there was, so to kind of backtrack, we were talking about before we got on about me discussing kind of the process of the piece, how it got, realizing it's getting darker in here, and that did not help. Oh, I tried.
It's so gorgeous.
Thank you. But so basically, I wanted to highlight the unknown story of the history of Lindy Hop. Like, I had heard the stories that we all hear, that people found Frankie Manning in the post office and asked him for, just found him, you know, just like digging through the mail.
What are you doing here?
They found him in the post office, and you know, then he taught the Swedes how to dance, and then there became all these events, and suddenly we had the Lindy Hop scene is kind of the gist of what I'd heard. And, you know, sometimes the like retro swing revival was kind of mentioned in there. You'd hear about the Gap commercial, but I had this question of, well, if the dance started off Black and by the 80s and 90s, it definitely was no longer Black. How? Like, what happened?
And you mean in the United States versus like Mamamoo and what was happening like in England and stuff like that?
I did forward this article because it was already long. It was already way too long. Stick
Yeah.
to United States history
Yeah.
specifically. I think I briefly touch on um, some of the Swedes and some of the stuff in Europe in the 80s, but it's just such a big topic. Um, as an aside, I may be like re-looking at this work and developing it into a bigger project
Yeah.
that I'm not going to discuss any more than that. But if I do, I will go down that path.
Yeah. So, okay,
But
so it's the American history, like it had largely become more white facing in the late 80s and 90s.
right, and I was curious as to how and why that happened. And I was aware that it was probably racism based, and I'd heard about Arthur Murray, but that wasn't enough of an answer for me. And as someone who's been doing research in about Black dances for as long as I have now, I find that it's hard to find non-white information, a non-white perspective about this time in history in particular, but specifically about swing. And so I decided, well, our culture is an oral culture, so it makes sense to go down an oral and a primary resources route. For those non-academically inclined or who do not remember from their early years, there are different types of research. There's reading a say a book that has been condensed down from a lot of different sources. There is reading a a kind of secondhand account of what happened. Like you hear it from a friend and then you write it down, and that's a style. And then there is the primary resources, which is I was there. I was there. I lived during that time. I wrote about it. I told the stories. I have the thoughts from right from the mouth. And so I wanted to look for those resources because I was curious as to what stories had been lost um, through the oral tradition not being written down, through people not respecting the oral tradition, and also it just seemed a little too clean of a history. It didn't make sense. Um, so I wanted to look at it, and so I went for only primary sources, conducted some interviews, which I need to do a few more, honestly.
Yeah.
And it started unfolding this kind of picture that there are really three different timelines that kind of happened simultaneously that got us to where we are today. So
And what do
yes.
you mean, Grey? What are the three different timelines?
So it started off as a Black dance, right? And that was kind of obvious. You could find articles about that. You also have to, if you're doing this kind of research, read through the lines a lot because most often, when it's covered in newspapers, for examples, it's going to be from a white perspective. And so you get a lot of white quotes and white thoughts on what is happening. So you have to be able to read through that bias to understand what is actually occurring.
Details that are consistent with the convenient narrative.
Or even just like, I quote a few of these in the article of things being said like, oh, it was dangerous and wild and just ooh, and one of my favorites is like somebody says, I think it was either Time or Life, I think, where they say, oh yeah, no white man will ever be physically talented enough to pull off this dance.
I felt like I was appreciating that they actually called out men on that one. I was like, oh, thank you that you didn't bring women into that one. But yeah, the white man is never going to be able to do this. I was like, cool, somebody's speaking some truth here. It's like, yeah, with that attitude, you're definitely not going to be able to embody a level of culture that you seem allergic to. So I was like, well, At least they're aware.
They were, and then they decided they were like, we're gonna the
Make it 6 pounds.
teens. The teens are like, I want to rebel against my white teens. We're like, I want to rebel against my parents. What's the worst thing I can do? Is let's go touch people in black spaces. Um, so,
And
so
listen to
they did
jazz.
that. It's the worst thing you could possibly do.
Oh, yeah.
So they did that, and it actually started a bit of an issue where essentially uh, swing and jazz wasn't really considered to be much of an art form at all. It was considered a fad.
Mm.
And it was considered as this thing that only the black people did in their hedonistic ways until the young people started participating, the young white people started participating and asking for it. And then people realized, oh, there's money in this.
So the capitalism of this kind of helped pull a cultural art form into the mainstream because it could be financed, exploited, separated from culture.
They were like, oh, well, we can make money off of this, and they had already been trying to encourage white youths to do folk dances instead, to do like the castle walk and other things of that nature. But the thing is,
like Irene Castle, that's who you're talking about with the castle walk. All right,
yep.
Cool. People, do your research. Yeah.
I briefly touch on it, but basically people were trying to dissuade the teens away from the scary swing dancing.
More ballroom, it shall keep you chaste.
Ballroom and square dancing.
What a rowdy way to get down. I'm sure the youth were like, yeah, wow, I really heated things up tonight with those triple steps in a circle.
And so they're like, exactly.
Yeah.
And so what I found interesting was how much that was intentional. I thought, oh, there's always this narrative that happens in these kind of histories of, oh, well, it was just the way at the time, or they didn't know any better. It wasn't intentional. And every article of this time period of the switch, where you start to split into two different histories, talks about it being incredibly intentional. That this was people who wanted to make money off of these white teenagers wanting to clean up the dance so that it would be acceptable for white teens and their parents to pay for them, and then give them the dance that they want. They didn't know that they wanted. And that's where you start getting into Arthur Murray coming about. And the Jockey Step, that one threw me. That one threw me so hard.
So great, let's talk about that for the people that haven't read the article. Talk about the jockeys. Sorry, the jockey is singular, but yeah.
Yeah, so, so basically there's an article talking about, I believe it's the World's Fair, but basically is one of the big fairs in New York City at the time. And it's right at this transition point between being primarily a black dance to being a craze among white teens. And so they got all of these dance instructors together, and they said, essentially, we need to clean this dance up. We're going to call it the hop, the World's Fair hop, or something similar. I forgot what it is.
Yeah.
Because for you all, this is recent, thing you read, and this is I wrote this so many months ago.
Yeah.
So many. but they called it this, and one of the things that came out of their meeting of all of these instructors trying to clean up Lindy Hop was the Jockey Step. It was created specifically for such a crowded venue to get people on the right foot, get people together, to make things easier and more approachable. And it was introduced as a part of the dance.
But not by the community, not by the progenitors.
No, not by the black people who were doing the dance
Yeah,
originally, but just as some instructors got together and they said, "Well, we want to make this dance safer and
yeah.
more appropriate and easier."
I love the
Um,
idea that the jockey was like the gateway to that, where they're like, guys, look, it's safe.
yeah, because it was so packed. They were like, "Yeah, you can like," and this is safer. This is more chaste. This is more
Yeah.
acceptable. Um, as well as like a lot of why Arthur Murray ended up changing the dance was for white men because he didn't think they were capable of doing the steps as they were. And so he like streamlined it so
Yeah.
that people could participate, um, but not in a
It's
way.
so it is so wild that white men have access to the world. Like they are in all of the halls of power. They've gotten to make so many decisions. And yet when it comes to dancing, it's like, no, I'm so sorry. Like we have no faith that you'll manage. You can start wars, you can run countries, you can decide that we're going to be on and off the gold standard. You can do all of these things, but we are not convinced that you're going to be able to manage a dance that doesn't have halftime steps.
But
Way to go,
dancing,
society. Way to go. Keeping it consistent.
I mean, there's a whole conversation there about infantilizing men and that we could get into. We could get into that is very complicated.
Yeah.
And but yeah, that was kind of the thing is
Yeah.
they wanted it to be they wanted to clean it up, and so they started creating things and taking away things to create a dance that they felt like the teens could do and their parents would approve of, um, and they knew it wasn't the same dance. Like that
Mm.
was on purpose. And I think sometimes when people tell a story, it's always like, oh, yeah, it just transformed over time. Or uh, I've heard the line told to me personally of, well, we, white people, have had the dance longer, so it's effectively ours
That's the equivalent of saying, well, I have a flag, so it's now mine. And you're like, okay, okay. Thank you for just telling me about the rule right now. It doesn't
now.
make any
Cool.
sense. God.
That's. And so I was like, okay. And I'd watched some documentaries from the 90s,
Yeah.
where they're so funny. They're so funny. You gotta watch them. The early 90s, late 90s, early 2000s
Yeah.
documentaries are a time capsule I didn't know I needed.
A time capsule in mediocrity. Come take a look, everybody.
It's very good, and I don't mean that like I appreciate that people did record what they recorded at that time because
Mm.
it does paint a very different picture than the story we're told now about that time frame. Um,
That's fascinating. Okay. Okay.
yeah, it's a lot. Again, it's a lot more intentional than I thought it was. Like that I
Mm.
hear at the time of people making choices and choosing things, and you can kind of even start seeing some of the issues that we have today forming then.
When you
And
say then, do you mean like the 80s, 90s? Do you mean like 50s,
I
60s?
mean, 80s, 90s.
Okay. Okay. Just double checking
Yeah,
which time block we're speaking in. Okay. Cool.
yeah. So one thing I also found interesting was in that documentary from the 90s, you know, people towards the end, some musicians are of the opinion
Uh-huh.
that um,
Read the article,
partner
everybody. Just saying, read the article.
partner dancing died out because um, people became too narcissistic, and they only wanted to solo dance. It's in this documentary, and several of them talk about this of
Yeah.
they didn't nobody wanted to be a man and a woman anymore. That's besides the fact that like
Oh, like cis
Lindy Hop
heteronormative, like
always
gender
been
roles
queer.
just didn't exist anymore.
Yeah, they were just like, yeah, nobody wanted to do that. Everyone was too narcissistic and self-absorbed, and they all wanted to dance alone. That's where the twist came from. And then magically, we found Frankie in the post office, and therefore now we're getting back to the good old days. And and we
I love that we went from some like badass jazz and some swing to narcissism. Men don't want to touch women anymore. So they just put the kibosh on that. Frankie was in the post office, and then there was ska music. Ta-da! We're here. Like, I mean, it's just
and the fact that no one questioned it the whole time. This is the story that I still hear the story from people today. And I knew there was clearly pits missing, but I didn't like.
I'm gonna have to do the twist every time I got to power up before I leave, Gray. I'm just like, okay, cool. I got to be narcissistic right now. I got to do the twist because that's how I know that like it's about me. Okay, now I'm ready.
You got to do the twist, and then they were like, yeah, and then dancing just died with rock and roll, and just.
Oh my God, that doesn't even make sense. The narrative's not even consistent. Okay, so this is also what's so interesting is that it's not consistent. It's convenient for the storyline that, I don't know, it takes us wherever somebody has engineered it. Fuck, Gray, fuck. Okay, were you just like having your mind blown, or did you feel angry, or was it just really like, the fuck is going
It's just fascinating. This is why it's so long. It's because like I said, I thought I had a general idea of what I was getting into. And then I didn't. And I was like, oh, narcissism. Like, how did you get to narcissism? Like, where did this narrative come from? Why do you think that partner dancing died? And that's why I started looking. So the reason I mentioned the 90s is that brought me back to like the 40s and 50s. Yeah. Because I was like, okay, well, when did it die? And everyone was like, oh yeah, by the 50s, late 40s, 50s, it died. I was like, okay. Well, what was happening during that time? And it turns out that split that had started off rather small but intentional was very drastic after that.
Ah, okay.
It expanded really quickly. Lindy Hop as a white craze, which then became East Coast swing and jitterbugs. Because at that point now they're called jitterbugs, which we'll talk about in a second. Yeah. Became this whole craze, like the one you know about. Everybody's doing it. It's everywhere. You can see it in the videos. Suddenly, there's a whole time, like several pages of articles about it. It's the new thing.
So what comes up must go down. What was new must be passed. Must be moved on from.
That was so. But at the same time, on the black side of things, you know, they were getting pushed out of jazz and swing, basically. Like there were some people who were still like pros and still doing really well. Like for instance, Frankie and Norma and them. But a lot of folks had started getting pushed out of their gigs, or it was just easier to hire white bands because things were segregated in the South and you couldn't tour there, and it's just bunch of problems. So why not pick the white band? They're almost as good, or even
they're almost, or the people won't know the difference because they haven't heard really incredible music before because they've been segregated from the anthology.
And at that point, race records, so records that were made by Black people to sell to Black people, were still pretty new. It was a new idea during this time. That maybe we should record Black artists. Maybe Black people wanted to buy music. Was still kind of
capitalism would do better. Of like, oh, these people probably have money and they might spend it on something.
Well, I mean, to be fair to them, this is the dark part. We didn't before. It was a new demographic, but it was realizing that we can make money from these race records. Maybe we should start recording Black bands. But then when white bands started picking up and forming, well, they were still being catered to the white audience.
Right.
So you could sell Black music to Black people, and you could sell white music to white people, and you could sell white music to Black people, but not Black musicians to white people. And so then you get this issue where you're starting to see the white bands really blow up. They get huge. huge and popular, and Lindy Hop goes to Hollywood, and it gets into all these shows and in all these movies, and all of these people, except for the scenes where it's like the servants dancing, are all white.
Right.
And what I found funny, and I got part of this is from Dr. Christy J's book,
Yeah.
Between the Beats. You should read it. Everyone should read it. It's very good. Uh, where they talk about like that. I'm blanking. Bebop.
Yeah.
Bebop has this myth that it's not danceable, and I thought I knew what bebop was before like reading this book and like looking into it. I was like, yeah, it's not danceable, but I was thinking of doo-wop, which is
which is different.
Yeah, it's not. It makes you and not like
free soul.
Yeah, it's a totally different subgenre. It's not at all the same. And then I was listening to it, I was like, oh, I know some of these songs.
Yeah.
What do you mean you can't dance to it?
Yeah.
And so then I became confused. And in Christian J's book, they go into like deep into that history.
Yeah.
But it turns out, to kind of summarize, that a lot of Black musicians got fed up with not being able to get paid. So they started experimenting. I know, shocker. They started experimenting with the music and pushed jazz. And they pushed and they pushed and they pushed and they pushed it so weird and avant-garde that it kind of circled back around to being Black.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly a branch of it is what it sounds like. A new lineage of where the artistry was going.
And so, because then they were like, well, we don't want to play for dancers. We want to play for particularly white dancers. We want to play for ourselves. And there's a bit of a debate about like some respectability politics of like not wanting to pay for Black dancers and yada yada yada. But like Black people still dance to it because that's how the culture works.
Yeah.
New music, dance to it. Like that's just what it is. And out of that became other dances that kind of branch off specifically from, I keep wanting to say doo-wop now, bebop.
Yeah. Bebop, yeah. Does bebop kind of start in the late 50s? Like, is there a sense on approximately when it transitions?
I believe it's
early 60s.
It's earlier. It's 40s, 40s and 50s.
Oh, okay. So it's even that earlier. Okay. So, okay. So then for the audience, because Gray, I think I just also made this mistake when I'm really thinking about bop and having the notion of like, this is not danceable. There is a point in some jazz music where it's like, you could move your body to that, but it's not going to resemble Lindy Hop in that same way because the music is noticeably different, but it's not like these two things were acting in isolation. Like there's a bridge between the styles because the musicians had to get there. So it's like, this still would have been very danceable, I assume, for quite some time. So like bop would have been partially transitioned before it got into wiggly noodly jazz. I know that there are more specific words and I lack the vocabulary.
So one of the things that's interesting about that time period to me, which I would need to do again, there's a reason why it's written the way it's written because there's so many tangents to dig into. But one thing that happens a lot with Black dances is they innovate over time, just like the music does.
Yeah.
And so before, yes, there was Lindy Hop, and then people took Lindy Hop and they modified it. And then you get dances like bop, like you said. There's also, I'm trying to remember, there's something, the walk. There was the halftime. Oh, no. It's the off time. The off time, I think, was the next variation of Lindy Hop, where you took Lindy Hop, but basically you put it on off time. And it became more about footwork. And so you take Lindy Hop, you can sit down into a small space, similar to Balboa-esque. And then you put it on the off time, and then you make everything be more about footwork. And then you've got the dance that was being done to bebop. And
Yeah.
then that changed with the music into other iterations of dances, which names
Yeah.
are escaping me right now because there's a lot
Yeah.
of them. It's a whole other
Yeah.
vein of research, um, to bop. And then from bop, you can literally trace the lineage of Black partner dances all the way to steppin' today.
So great. Just as an aside, you just mentioned all these partner dances, and yet the storyline in the white community is that there are no partner dances at this point. Narcissism reigns supreme, and the division has happened, and
Mhm.
yet that is absolutely not true for everybody.
So the Black dances continued the whole
Yeah,
time.
but
It's
they
the
were not
white
noted by
dance.
the white community.
The white dances didn't, but white history is written by the victors. And another way of thinking about it is by the powerful.
Hmm.
So if white audiences are not interested in it, if it does not contribute to their narrative, it doesn't get written about or written down.
Mm.
So the only reason I was able to find out about, say, specifically the off time was digging through the Steppers oral archives
Wow. Okay.
and not at all the swing dancers because they've
Mm.
done a lot of interviews over the years and have them transcribed. Uh, and then you can read in like from people who were living during that time period or whose parents were living during that time period about
Yeah.
dances like the off time, which if you read a book about Lindy Hop, you're never probably going to read unless it happens to be like, for instance, maybe Christy J's book. Like
Yeah.
that's very specific in looking at a more holistic view of history.
Yeah.
Uh, you want to know why people think that partner dancing died off?
Tell me, Gray.
It's when the Black musicians took uh, jazz and made it into bebop.
Yeah.
They were intentional about making it too hard for white folks to dance to or to play.
Mm. I remember you had written in the article that like a number of Black musicians playing with some of the white musicians, if they didn't read music as well and everything else had been transcribed, then it was like, okay, well, this isn't going to work if we are doing it, having passed it down this way versus having to read your charts. That it's like, okay, well, cool. Then good luck writing this down because you're not going to be able to. This comes from a feeling. This doesn't come from notes on a paper, notes on a
Right.
page. Muscle
Like
man.
that was one of those kind of filtering processes, which was
Gotcha.
writing it down, and
Yeah.
then not to say that no Black musicians could read music, that would be
Right.
incorrect.
No, no, of course.
But like
Sorry. Yeah.
many of them couldn't because they had learned to play through our culture, which
Yeah.
doesn't value written as much as oral trainings or experiential learning.
Right.
And so there would be a reason to there's a play / film about this, which I can't remember the name of right now.
Great story, Ray.
I know. I watched it with people during the pandemic, which is why I don't remember.
It's
Real
all a bit
fun.
of a blur, so that totally makes sense.
Yeah, it's all a bit of a blur. I don't
Yeah.
know, but people would use that as a way of filtering people out, and so they were like, "Well, we don't want your money anyway. We're gonna go do our own thing in our small
Right.
clubs."
Mhm.
Uh, and play our music our way that we want to do and experiment.
Yeah.
And they were right. A lot of white musicians could not play bebop
Mm.
for a while. Like, of course, there's always some. There's always at least one. There's always that white guy in the group. Like, that's just a
Yeah.
thing. But like, a lot of people couldn't. But the white narrative continued for a little while. But they
Right.
stopped having the Black artists pushing the music and pushing the
Mm.
dance as much.
Right.
So then you start getting more and more groups narrowing and codifying things down, narrower and narrower and narrower,
Yeah.
until it was boring.
Mm. Yeah.
It was boring. It was expensive. It was after the war. No one could afford bands that big.
Right.
Um, every town had a band. So, like, what was the difference between that band and this band? Jukeboxes started coming out. White teens realized that rock and roll was a thing that was concurrently happening. And they were like, oh, I want to rebel against my parents. You know what the worst thing I can do is go touch black people. Like,
Elvis shows up on the scene eventually with those hips, and that's got to be the
Johnny
devil's
Reagan, and the cycle continues.
Yeah.
And so in the white narrative, if you don't know the black history, yes, the partner dancing did die. It did die with rock and roll, and then people did start doing the twist primarily in solo dances.
Yeah.
And then it didn't come back because then white people took rock and turned that into moshing and things of that nature, which is even less, like far less partner dancing.
Yeah.
And then we start to get into the 80s.
It's the good old days of shoulder pads. Yeah, yeah.
It's like, for me, of all the research, that was the most interesting time period, I think. The transition between it being a black dance in the 80s and watching in the 70s where advertisements start playing up the good old days of swing. And I have some of these books that come with records, and the records and the books are very curated. I bought some of these books because I wanted to see what they were talking about in the 60s and 70s about swing. And the first one talks about black people a little bit, and the remaining books get whiter and whiter and whiter and whiter. And they talk about how, like, oh yeah, this is America's dance. This is when the good old days and conservative values, and women were women and men were men, and it was innocent fun, which is very different from the makeouts and reefer.
What are you talking about, Gray? Would I find that information in the lyrics? As somebody who grew up not listening to lyrics, and I still do this today, where I'm just like, okay, I really like the vibe, and then at some point I'm like, let me actually like really listen into what is being said. Where there's a number of songs I'm like, oh yeah, no, like I thought we were saying this, and then at some point it's also like, oh, I don't even have the words right. Like I thought we were saying like bottle of beer, and you're not even close to that. And I like, that there's many memes about people thinking that it was this set of words, and I was like, you're not even close. It's this, and you're like, all right, I guess I like can't hear things as well. But like, yeah. If you listen to the music, if you understand what is being spoken about, there's no way that you could think that this was like good, wholesome Christian experiences where like everybody kept their distance. It was all very polite. Everybody like curtsied afterwards and like went to their corners to keep square dancing or whatever. Like you couldn't do that if you were listening, if you paid attention to what was actually happening there.
But that's only if you were listening to black bands, because by that point, a lot of white bands had sanitized it, and they'd picked certain songs, and they'd smoothed
like
over.
That one, I was just like, yeah, this is just really fun. I had no idea what was going on. I think really until 5 or 6 years ago, I was like, yeah, it's just like a basic like shim sham song. And then it was like, hey, did you know? I was like, no, I didn't. Y'all, you should go look that up. It's on the internet. You can figure out what that is. We're talking about other things, but Flatfoot Floogie, that is a song worth looking into the lyrics. You're welcome.
I think I have a whole article. It's old now. That is about the importance of listening to lyrics in black music, because I got tired of people saying, oh, well, for blues specifically, people are like, oh, well, all blues songs sound the same. And I'm like, well, if you're listening to the like repetitive part of the song, then yes. But you're listening to the wrong part. That's not where we put the emphasis in our music. It's in the lyrics, not that part. And that was particularly like mind-blowing for some people. Like, yeah, you have to listen to the lyrics. Like I have a song that I love that
Yeah.
is called Play with Your Poodle. It's not about a dog. Like, it's just not.
For your 10-inch recorder.
Warm My Wiener is another song. There's a whole genre of blues that is called hookah blues music that is not wholesome, good fun.
You're saying that it's not because they have really good hooks? I'm jet lagged. I haven't been drinking, I promise. Okay, right. So for all of you that don't pay as much attention to the lyrics, you're missing some gems. That's
You're missing some really good jokes, some really good stories
yeah.
that are definitely worth listening to.
Yeah.
But basically, yeah, like it had been transformed into America's Dance.
That's amazing that it got transformed to America's Dance despite not being accepted as a dance form or worth recognizing until it became a fad in the white community.
Right.
Convenient.
Helpful that.
Yeah.
And that's why all the pictures are of mostly white people, except for, of course, the couple specific imagery that we as a community pick out that highlights Black people, specifically from Hells of Poppins, which
Yeah.
as an aside, am I the only one who has always been extremely uncomfortable watching that? Like, the dancing is amazing, but I can't get past
The outfits.
the outfits. I can't. I've always been like, I appreciate the dancing. It is great. But the fact that I know this is the only, like, I'm pretty sure this is the only scene they're in, and they're just like the cooks and things, like
Yeah.
showing their wild side. I'm
Yeah.
like, I just look.
Yeah. So for anybody in Europe who's watching this, something that you might not know because you have a different history is that when movies were shown in the South because of segregation, there was many times where the clips of Black excellence were taken out and completely removed, which is why dance scenes could be filmed in a way that it just seemed a little bit like if you watch the entire movie, you're like, okay, this is kind of dropped in. And it was because that they needed to be able to be removed so that the Black community was only ever seen as being a servant or being in a role of helping the white community instead of existing in their excellence. So if you didn't know that, that's one of the many curious and interesting things about details in America. So if you didn't know that because you're not an American, Europeans, this is something that you should be aware of when you watch older clips, is that you see them as a clip, but many of them have been in movies. And if you haven't watched the whole movie, you don't have a context about how that was seen or how it was shown and why people were dressed a very particular way, just as Grace said. So like, there's more to say about that, but Europeans, like if this is new to you, there's a lot more of the backstory just for you to get more depth to that experience. All right, sorry, continue, Gray.
Oh no, please, thank you. Like, I think that is an important thing to notice. And like, for example, you can see that if you compare, say, a Fred and Ginger clip to I mean, there's a bunch of clips of Black dancers in film, but typically it's showgirls or they're exotic or they're, it's the servants on the boat. It always has that kind of theming to it. And I understand historically where it comes from, but the fact that those are the images that we continue to bandy about so prolifically rather than say like Alman's and Leon's performance at Playboy is it gives me some feelings. It's a whole rant, but it gives me some feelings. But that was a part of the process of kind of sanitizing this imagery down to there's that wild version that they did, and now we've cleaned it up. It's America's Dance. And that nostalgia started in the 70s. So then
it's wild that it started that far back. I very much was like, this is like an 80s, 90s thing, but it goes even further back than that.
It's like late 60s, early 70s. There's a whole series of advertisements that ran for a while. That's all,
Yeah.
like, I think it's a 2 to 4 page spread, um, highlighting these records and books that were coming out. It's either in
Mm,
Time or Life. I
mm,
think that's Time
mm.
that did this. And it's like you can still find the books and the records today. Like I just saw some of the records on sale um, about an hour from me, and I thought about going to buy them. I don't have a record player, but I thought about going to buy them because I wanted the experience. But then I was like, I have the books, which is more of the thing I was looking for specifically for myself.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, they started the nostalgia then. So by the time you get to the 80s and 90s, you kind of have two different populations in the white community that show up. You
Mm,
have the people who are interested in that music or
mm.
that dancing. They found
Yeah.
those old clips. They found their parents' records from that age, whatever, what have you. And they've decided that they want to go find the original dancers. They want to go find them, which is where you
Mm,
start getting into the story with Frankie. But actually,
mm,
they found, I believe, Al Min's first.
mm. Yeah.
Uh, and then, because I think Leon had died by that point, I think. Or he was around for a year or two, I think, and then he
That's
died.
the story I understand as well. But somebody said, give me extra sources to prove it. I'd be like, I don't have them at the moment. So yeah.
I could piece it
Yeah.
together, but I believe that because now we're into some of the video archives, which I need to
Yeah.
like go back through and date and all the things. But um, yeah, I believe they found Al Min's first,
Yeah.
and then that's when he met the Swedes and they flew him out. He thought they were in the mob. He thought they were the mob because he's like, what are these people? These blonde hair, like blue eyed people who are looking for me.
I mean, if you grew up in America and you were black, there's probably no good reason why you'd be like, this is gonna work out in my favor at the end. That people that look like that are interested in find and have found me. Like
Yeah,
historically speaking, that was not necessarily like, y'all, we're gonna give you some land, we're gonna give you an opportunity. Like that's just not. Thanks,
right.
America.
That's just not typically how it goes, and it
Yeah.
was uh, startling to him because it was also very quick, and he was just like at the club. He was just at the club, and these people just like rolled up to come talk to him, and he's like,
Wow.
um,
Wow.
and so you get to kind of start seeing that narrative come about, and you
Yeah.
watch over time as um, Europeans started learning from Al Men's and Leon and then Frankie. Uh, there starts to be a bit of a split happening where there's a
Mm,
certain amount of excitement about the dance outstripping knowledge about the dance. But people were
mm.
really excited. They wanted to dance with everyone. So people were like, oh, I'll teach you how to dance.
Mm.
Yes, they
What time
did.
period are we? Are we in like the 90s when like the craze has come back in the white community, or are we still kind of
We're
pre?
still in the 80s.
Okay,
We're
still in the
still
80s. Okay. Okay.
We're still in the 80s. The craze hasn't come back. It's getting there because
Yeah.
then you're starting to see that come about in the Bay Area, in New York, in some of these Seattle, like the coast,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, where people are getting excited about Lindy Hop.
Mm.
And the instruction they've gotten directly from some of the elder Black people at the time
Yeah.
didn't always make sense to them
Mm.
in terms of they wanted counts. They wanted clarity. They
Yeah.
wanted things to be clean and organized and structured. And that's not the instruction they were getting.
I mean, how would you know if you were perfect if you didn't know what all of the numbers were every single count?
And one thing that stands out to me is there's a video of Norma talking about this happening. And
Mm.
she says, she's like, you should watch Frankie. Like everyone should be watching Frankie and learning from Frankie. And I think people decided to not continue to listen to the next part. Is she says, because he gets it, he feels
Yeah.
it, and you need to learn how to feel it and not worry about counts so much. You need to like
Yeah.
understand it in this way, and he understands it in this way.
Yeah.
Uh, and then it cuts to the clip of some European instructors being like, I hear you saying that,
Yeah.
but I'm European. I need the counts. Like
Yeah, this doesn't apply to me. I'm sorry. That doesn't apply to me. I'm European. That's not my problem.
and it was, and it was, it was, do we, so sorry, there's a bit of a
Greg, we should keep going. So yeah,
okay.
Tim, do it.
Bye. But there was a bit of a conversation around, do like if I'm excited about the dance and there's no dancing in my area and I'm the best person, well, I want to dance, so I should teach other people. And that is very endearing and very sweet and very like good in some ways. But what's hard is it's also um, it's like baby dancers now when they think they're ready to teach and they bring a lot, as much enthusiasm as they can sometimes bring a lot of issues with them, preconceived notions, things they haven't worked out yet, things they don't understand, but they think they understand better than they actually do.
Yeah.
And this was the population that had essentially started teaching Lindy Hop.
Yeah.
And it spread. And it started spreading.
Great. This is like dating in your 20s versus your 30s, where you're like, I know everything. And then you're like, well, that was fun.
Well, yeah.
I'm feeling like you see me. Or I'm getting called out. Either way, it's kind of the same thing.
Unfortunately, it does tend to be the same, but it is just like, and yes, I get that. Where you're like, and you're like, I don't know what I'm doing. No one knows what they're doing.
Yeah, but you're like, I'm excited. All of this is new. Like, I'm gonna just like do my best, and I'm gonna bring my issues, and I won't have worked through them because I didn't know I had them. Nobody told me I had these issues. Like, I just have the excitement, and I'm new here, and you're like, oh, thanks, welcome.
Yeah, and the excitement is not necessarily a bad thing, and I think
It's just what is it coupled with?
And people have a lot of nostalgia for this era in some ways too, as well. Because it was perceived as like this was this exciting Wild West time where you could do whatever you wanted.
Yeah.
And you could, but you shouldn't. But what was happening simultaneously was from the rock scene.
Mm-hmm.
The
like rockabilly?
No, well, rockabilly, then that turned into rock, like actual rock and metal. So you get the punks. This is the other part that's fascinating.
Right.
The aging punks turned into the neo swing scene.
Mm-hmm.
Because everyone was a punk. And the way to rebel, this time the story is different, but the way to rebel in that case was to not do the things your parents hated, but to do the like socially acceptable thing, was to lean into American exceptionalism, that everything was better in the good old days, that men were used to be men and women used to be women, and our cars were better and this was better and we used to do these things, and what were we rebelling against anyway? And people say it wasn't, they weren't trying to be conservatively valued, but and so they ended up becoming exactly what they were fighting against in their teen years, which is also another cycle that happens in white America, which I find fascinating.
Yeah.
And they actually thought the dancers were really They were boring and nerdy and just like not cool.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas for them, they thought the coolest thing was to go to a smoky bar with your punk band that had turned into ska and sip
Yep.
martinis with hot
Mm-hmm.
rods. And dancing was there, but
Yeah, it wasn't the main event.
no.
Yeah.
And then these scenes came together because of advertisements.
I was thinking the movie Swing Kids as well. Like at some point, Swing Kids, I think it was early 90s, like that came out.
Mhm.
I remember seeing some of those dance scenes. I think that there was another like Brendan Fraser movie, like Atomic something or Back from the Past or something like this. And I remember seeing more swing dancing. And then at some point, the Gap commercial comes out where it's like, wow, okay, cool. So just like flash mobs, at one point, it was like a much smaller thing. And then by the time like Wells Fargo Bank is doing it, you're like, all right, the fad has ended, but the tail has just arrived.
Yeah.
So, okay.
And that's kind of how it went, was like basically because of the media pushing it as this idealism thing, because they were seeing so many people getting into neo swing and pushing the kind of American exceptionalism idea. And so, of course, people are going to use it for advertising and nostalgia and the good old days, making movies about it. There became this huge interest in swing. But by this point, it had been watered down and reshaped into America's chaste white dance that was pure as a selling point.
Yeah.
But then the neo swing scene was all about drugs, sex, and alcohol.
Dangerous.
So both communities got an influx of people, new people, looking for any dancing of any kind. So some of the swings, the like dancer scenes started loosening up a little bit.
Yeah.
Started going out to the neo swing scene. Some of the neo swing people started going to the dancer stuff and learning how to teach a bit. Suddenly there was social power in teaching. There was social power in dressing vintage. And over time, these scenes kind of came together.
Yeah.
The problem is no one ever unpacked the values that those two disparate scenes brought together. So today we have a community that's seen as very chaste and wholesome and family friendly.
Yeah.
And also, you know, whether people want to admit this or not, a lot of people do drugs. A lot of people drink a lot. There's a lot of partying. There's a lot of sex. There's a lot of consent issues. There's a lot of things that happen in the scene that nobody talks about.
Yeah.
But it's still there underneath this very, it's fun and joyful and family friendly, and you can do whatever you want. You can Lindy Hop and Blackness.
It's not political. I'm just here to have a fun time. Like, yeah. Aren't we all, darlings? So Grey, you are very much now talking about my history, about how I'm connected to the community and what I saw growing up. So how much of this also feels like your history? So I started dancing around 2000-ish, and then like I was a teenager. So like Americans can't go to bars until they're 21. So this whole like drink when you're 16, like we just don't have that. So I wasn't old enough to go to places that had a bar. Like you're not even allowed into a place with a bar if you're under 21. So I very much went to like the family friendly joints. There was only water. It's a dance floor. And it was really safe. Like my parents were like, you're fine. As long as you do well in school, you can go out and dance. Like I was not a problem kid. So that was all fine. So this is sounding very much like my history. And I remember like the kind of the culture wars in terms of dressing. We had the scenesters that looked amazing, but they were not good dancers. And then you had us that looked casual, would be one of the ways to describe that. Casual, who were definitely more focused on the dancing, but it was not a stylish bunch at the time. And then eventually it converged. So Grey, where were you at this time? Like, has your dance history started at this point, or is this still just kind of what's been passed and then you kind of get like the edge of this story?
I am definitely in terms of the swing Lindy Hop jazz community on the edge of this story.
Okay.
Um, so I started after that period.
Okay.
Because for instance, like I think I had seen some swing dancing before,
Yeah.
but I grew up in small town Ohio, and like most of my time, like one, I'm an unusual case in it anyway, but just like a lot of the time I spent was either in white spaces,
Yeah.
uh, but not in that kind of overly family friendly type
Mm.
of deal because I'm
Yeah.
black and those people don't like you in Ohio. Um, I mean, that's just kind of it's kind of the
Yeah.
fact.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, there's black spaces where I was dancing, even
Yeah.
though at the time I was said I wasn't a dancer. I hated dancing because I'd been made fun of a few times and was scared.
Oh,
Yeah, maybe me. It's a story. Um, Now look at me, ha. Uh,
look at you now.
but yeah, I'd been dancing, but I've been dancing in the black way, which is just kind of like as a part of life, not a
I was going to say, for some of us white
way.
people, if you could specify what that means to dance in the black way, some of us are like, "What is that?" So
Yeah,
you just did, but
yeah. That one of the things that I love telling people is jam circles were a thing when I was a kid. We didn't have
Mhm.
a name though. It was just like the thing you did in the yard or in the driveway with your
Yeah,
friends is there would
yeah,
be music, you would all clap, somebody would go in or you get pushed in, you go
yeah.
jam, you'd get out, sometimes you get booed. Like it's just like the kids,
I'll be honest
and
with you.
they will. And that was like
How
a
you
game that you
That's
would
how you
do.
did it. Yeah, yeah.
There's a lot of rhythm games. There's a whole book about what's it called? Games Black Girls Play, I believe,
Mhm.
where they talk about the rhythms of childhood in black spaces of like doing double dutch and
Yeah.
how that matters like musically and rhythmically towards your dancing
Mm.
later in life, going to church and going dancing, roller skating. I still find it funny that people are like, "Oh, we're going roller skating tonight." I'm like, "Yeah, people been doing
Coming
that."
back It's coming back in.
Yeah, I'm like, "Yo,
Yeah.
that's just like what black kids do." Like I don't know. Like we did it. It's not. And then
Yep.
yeah, there's the ones who do the tricks and go backwards, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, this is a thing." I'm like, "Okay, where y'all been for the last 20
Where y'all
years?"
been? You're late to the party, like 25 years late, unless you're
But
gonna take back to the 40s, 30s.
it's
Yeah,
that's how these things cycle. But that's what I mean by like the black way of like you
yeah,
play music on Sundays and you dance because that's what you do. Your
yeah,
grandfather grabs you and you do dancing in the kitchen and like that's
yeah.
just a thing. I didn't go to dance classes until I went to college, and that's where I encountered swing dancing uh, in Lindy Hop and in blues originally.
Yeah.
So I joined when there was the start of the blues. What is blues discussion? Um,
I'm sure that's a whole thing too.
and that's the whole thing. Um, that's when I started, which was like 2012,
Uh-huh.
11, 12,
Okay, so it
somewhere.
really is about 10 years ago, because in my mind, 10 years ago is like 2010, but then it's not that year, but also like the 80s was 20 years ago, and that apparently is not true any longer. So it's like, what's time? Well,
What
yeah,
is
yeah.
time? Yeah,
What is
it's yeah.
Yeah. So Gray, I just want to highlight something, and I'm sure enough people have like made the connection here, but just in case they haven't, like so the way I grew up, one would dance, like you could like listen to music and like kind of wiggle around, but it's not something we did as a group unless you were in like cotillion classes or you were taking line dancing in PE or you went to a place to go learn. Like it wasn't, and like I'm not saying I have like everybody, like obviously like white people are also not a monolith. So I'm not saying that my experience is the same for everybody else, but I grew up in a middle class family where you would take on an activity and you'd go learn how to do it. There would be a coach and you were taught. And this concept of just like you just do this because you do it, is such a different discussion about how one connects to music, how one connects to lyrics, how one moves their body in rhythm. What does it mean to just have a connection versus being told like your value is how well you learn as a student and that's how you excel. And it's a game of money. Do you have the finances to do it versus just being like, I exist in a world where this is part of the language. This is part of our existence, this, which is just like, so for the listeners, like perhaps that was a little bit like too obvious right there, but like that's just such a big fucking moment of this conversation. If you learn through the white pipeline, because that's what the world, that's how the world worked that you grew up in, it makes sense why we're having in some ways on the split screen two different discussions about how is this dance passed down, which if you grow up in a place where you only listen to music and only get to dance in particular spaces or safe spaces, then yeah, of course this is going to be a different experience than if you just got to exist in a place where it was common. Like, and this is part of the discussion about how do we pass this on when your lived, like my lived experience is different than Gray's. So it's like, as an instructor, also, how do you talk about this? So that probably gets into a different discussion, but like, just in case anybody needs a feeding of like, that was a big fucking moment. Appreciate what just happened. Okay, that was my little tangent. Back to you, Gray.
Yeah, I in some of the following articles, like we'll get into that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Talking about, I think the next one is specifically about white bias, which basically is just this assuming that the way you've done things is the only way of doing a thing, and where it comes up and why it can be an issue. Because essentially, like, and I hated dance, and I still had to dance throughout my life. Like, I refused. I didn't dance at any of the high school dances. I didn't know any of the fad dances that came up. I refused to learn because I was too shy and embarrassed. And I still learned like basic rhythm, basic dancing, basic skills. I know how to sing. Like these are the things that you like have you do because it's a part
You
of
just do
like living
so
your life.
regularly. It's just a part of the vernacular.
Right. And so going to an actual class, I remember being incredibly confused. I was like, oh, wait, oh, okay, we got like, now we go over here. Now we, like, it was, yeah, it was a lot of that. And I was just like, okay. And what was confusing for me was I remembered I would hear the music and I was like, this sounds familiar, but everyone here is white. And I couldn't put my finger on it for a while. And then somebody would ask me, they're like, oh, do you know this song? And I'd go, no. And they go, well, you were singing it or humming it. And I was like, oh, I don't think I've heard this song.
Yeah.
But it feels familiar. And it took a little while for me to put the pieces together that although I had not heard those songs for a long time, I had heard them with my grandfather when I was younger. And that's what he would mostly play, was swing and blues and a little bit of soul, a little bit of funk, but like that was what he played as the living around the house music.
Yeah.
And so I knew these songs and I'd heard these songs and I danced to these songs and I'd moved to these songs. And yet there was this dissonance of I'm in a white group and we're now learning like
Step, step, rock, step. Sorry, jockey.
Yeah.
Add to rock.
Yeah. I was like, okay. I mean, I'm liking dancing, but actually I didn't like dancing. I was still having panic attacks at that point. To be fair, I was going through a very bad breakup and I just needed a distraction.
I'm going through a breakup. I'm going to do something I really don't like, so I'm distracted by this other
literally on it. That was literally the thought. Is I was like, I mean, I'm already unhappy. I might as well go learn something I don't like. I might as well.
Oh, great! Oh my god!
I was really unhappy, and I will tell you that story off stream because it's particularly funny with me as I am today versus
who you were. Great. I love that. Maybe that's how I'm gonna like really work on my German. I'll just keep that in mind for later of like, okay, if I'm already doing something, I'm not like, if I'm already not feeling excited about this thing, let's just keep rolling because I'm rolling forward every day. That's one way to deal with it.
You know, and like I tell this to new people that I teach all the time, which is
Yeah.
basically like I used to have a panic attack after every single class. Every single class. And the only way I was able to dance is at some point, it had been a few weeks, and I was like, I'm going to sit here for one dance. Not even going to ask anybody, not talk to anybody. I'm just sitting here. And I'm like, I am absolutely miserable. And then I'd go home and have a panic attack. And then the next time is 2 songs. And then I had a good dance.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is terrifying, but I get it. And I continue to have panic attacks, but it's more about like it can be scary to start dance, and I think we sometimes forget that not everybody like jumps in head first. But like anything in life, if you are determined to do it, it can be hard, and you can be okay if you just take it a little baby step at a time. And now I'm a dance instructor, so like what? Like. You know,
full circle. You're like, not only am I gonna like beat this, I'm gonna crush it, and then I'm gonna pass on the joy to somebody else. Oh, great. You're such a fucking gem. So Ray, I'm just noticing about how we're doing on time here. I'm really, really enjoying myself, but why don't we like wrap up in the next 15 minutes or so that we can make sure that we hit on some of the other details in the article and or talk about what's coming next that you're excited about. But otherwise, I'm just like, I am loving this conversation. So
yes, for sure.
Amazing. So okay, so for full circle and here you are. So great. I guess like who told you the narrative? Was it your teacher? Like, did anybody ever say this is the narrative that we're holding on to, or was it just kind of like, I don't know, it just kind of like slipped into the room where you're like, I don't know, nobody really said anything, but it's kind of the shared knowledge about where this went, or somebody asked the question like, hey, how did this happen? And then somebody actually gave the story. Like, how did you connect with the modern day white story?
I believe I had been taking a few classes for a while, and the person that was teaching regularly asked me if I'd seen House of Poppin'.
Yeah.
And I don't remember why that came up, but he was like, oh, you have to see this. And so there's a bunch of us crowded around his cell phone as we watch this, you know, as we watch this clip. It might have been a laptop, but I think it was a cell phone. And I remembered I was like, one, y'all are too close to me. Because it was too early. It was too early in my like dance history. I was like, y'all are too close to me.
Back
not about it. But also, I remembered watching and being like, because everyone around me was really odd, all white people. And I remember being like, I think y'all are not seeing their outfits. And I wasn't given context about their outfits, I believe. But I was just told like this is one of the best Lindy Hop videos. And I think we watched a few other ones after that, like doing the kind of thing you do. But I think it was just kind of a brief like, oh yeah, this dance used to be black. Here are some old examples of it. Then we found Frankie in the post office, and now we're dancing the Muse. And that was the trajectory. I'm not kidding the Muse bit either. Like dancing the Muse and Cake were the primary songs. We danced in the Tink Tinks, if anybody remembers them from several years ago. Which is why sometimes I say, oh, I consider myself to have started in fusion, not particularly blues or swing. Because musically,
it was more fusion of things than
and like it got the students excited, which was the important thing for a college club. Like I understand why, and when I took over, I also had to do that. But I remembered being like, okay. Um, but when that was said, I said there was a bit of a click for me of
Mm,
now this music makes sense. These half memories I have make sense.
yeah.
And that's when I started really getting curious about, well, why does dancing with you all feel different than the way I
Mm,
expected to?
mm,
And then I traveled to my first event, I think 3 or 4 months in,
yeah.
um, and that's with someone else who was black. And
Mm,
then suddenly it was like, oh, it makes sense. Oh, it makes so much sense. Oh dear. Now all the things are coming together. I get
yeah.
it now. And then I've been kind of on this like casual crusade over the last few years to try and figure out what exactly makes it different
Yeah.
and why is it so different.
Yeah.
Uh, so I think partially osmosis is the way I think about like having, you have dinner and somebody brings up a tidbit or whatever.
Yeah.
Uh, but I've also known for a long time that there's something missing.
Mm, yeah.
I just didn't realize how much was missing.
I mean, like Gray, as you say this, it's like I have for so long felt really comfortable in the community because I am white. So as I would travel, I'd be like, oh yeah, these students learn the same way I do. Like they have the same challenges. Like they do and don't hear the music in similar ways. So like that sense of like shared culture, like I have shared the culture with the people that have been in the community
Mhm.
where like and I don't know how many people have really thought about this. If the scene had largely been black, how many of the white dancers would have actually gotten into it? And I'll be honest, like the world that I grew up in, I don't think I would have ended up in it because hip hop was really accessible at the time, like in the 90s and early 2000s. And I knew I wanted to dance. Like I liked wiggling. I played sports. So like I was certainly active, but that was not the music I listened to. It was not talking about an experience that I had. It was not my life that they were reflecting. And the movement didn't make sense because it's a reflection of the experience that is being spoken about. And it just seemed dangerous and wild. So it was like, oh, swing dancing, it's super safe. So like when I think back, I mean, like I find this absolutely tragic and it's embarrassing to say, but like I genuinely don't believe I would have gotten into swing dancing had it been a community that was largely black. I had not been in all black spaces or primarily spaces that were black. Like I had only really been in white spaces. So it's like, I wonder how many of the other Lindy Hoppers have also thought about that, which is like, would you have actually joined the community if there was a better level of diversity? Or even if it was more of a black space, would people have been comfortable? And you grew up in a world where there was a lot of whiteness, so you've had to learn how to code switch, and exist in that way. So, like, I think about it from the other side of like, yeah, of course. Like, I've never had to think about it because I already felt as comfortable as I awkwardly did growing up.
Right. And that is kind of one of the things is that like I've spent most of my life in primarily white spaces. And
Yeah,
so I do remember that time period
yeah,
um, where I went from primarily black only spaces to
yeah,
white only spaces very quickly
yeah,
and being absolutely confused, just confused and
yeah,
overwhelmed. I was in like third grade, so old enough, but not old enough to
yeah,
like understand what was happening. Um,
yeah,
and I reflect on that time period a lot and a lot of other little moments
yeah,
uh, throughout my life where that's kind of come to the forefront. But you're right, most people probably wouldn't have joined a black Lindy Hop space
yeah,
because we for me is basically every minority have to always be able to see ourselves in the majority, and the majority does not. So they assume that, oh, I can't relate, or this isn't
right,
the space for me,
yeah,
or now it's unobtainable to me somehow. Um, and if you never have to switch, if you never have to code switch, most people
yeah,
won't. Like,
yeah,
why would you do the uncomfortable thing?
right, yeah,
Like, and that's why, in a lot of ways, like not only has Lindy Hop became white,
Yeah.
but it stayed white in that way, because why would
The
you do
energy
things
generated.
differently?
Yeah, yeah. The friends that
The
you bring in,
way
your friends probably look like you. Yeah, yeah. It's a self-feeding cycle.
they probably look like you, they probably think like you, they probably want the same things that you want, they value the
Yeah,
same things that you value,
yeah.
they grew up in similar ways that you did. And so it creates this culture
Mm,
that, although in and of itself is not hostile necessarily, although there
mm,
is some hostility, is like stepping into a foreign space for non-white people.
mm.
Like, and that it's that duality of it that, particularly for Lindy Hop, I've always found really interesting,
Yeah.
because when I dance with other Black people, it feels like coming home.
Mm.
When I
Yeah,
dance with, or when I just exist in a Lindy Hop space, I
yeah.
feel out of place.
Mm. Even
Like,
now.
even now, definitely now, definitely now, because I no longer even try to adhere to the white norms anymore.
Mm.
Like, I'll show up like this,
Yeah.
and this is too wild and dangerous for
So urban, which would be, and I put that in quotes because there's been a big discussion around that word, but yeah. So you show up looking too urban.
too urban, which is hilarious, because like in the scale of it depends who you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I don't try to do the vintage thing anymore.
Yeah.
Tried that, didn't like it.
Hmm.
For myself,
Hmm.
uh, I'm not super conventional anyway,
Hmm.
and you know, in white spaces, standing out in that way is a bad thing.
Yeah.
So it
So,
makes life hard.
so clearly, and Gray, you state this in the article as well, which is like it's really important to understand the history and not just like one of the versions of history, but a more holistic approach so that you understand that there wasn't one narrative because there wasn't one group of people involved in the story. And anybody that has dated somebody should know that there's always two sides of the story. And depending on who you speak to, there's events that coincide, but like how people saw things are unique to them and their experience. So why would history be any different? So like if we would like to build something that was more comfortable for more people with multiple identities, orientations, et cetera, et cetera. Like there's a way to do that, but it does require that we actually know more of the story. Because if I only know the story that is convenient for me, it's going to be really hard to imagine what could be a better way to be supportive, how to make how to make a space safer or more welcoming, or even how to have the conversation because they don't have the vocabulary because they don't have a lived experience. So, like, I guess without trying to like completely feed you the line, it sounds very much like we need to understand our history so that we can build something better. Otherwise, we are going to be repeating what we've already done.
Well, yes, I think so, and I think a lot of times people, and I was like this myself before, recently, and it's probably partly because of the American school system is terrible
Mm,
in a lot of ways. Um, but history, you can look at history as a bunch of facts and figures, and that makes it really hard to relate to. It makes it hard
yeah,
to know where you fit into that.
right.
But when you look at history as a series of stories, as a series of lives and choices that were made,
Yeah,
suddenly you feel yourself in the rhythm of the life of the experience,
yeah,
um, and that makes it way more real. And I think
yeah,
that realness allows people to then know that you're not learning history because you ought to. You're learning
yeah,
history because it deepens your relationship with this thing you love.
yeah,
And then, more importantly, something I say, and I think I say in one of the articles, is like somebody has to be uncomfortable
yeah,
in interracial, intersectional spaces.
yeah,
The question is who.
yeah,
So if you're 100% totally comfortable the whole time, somebody else is paying for that comfort.
mm,
And that comfort that like doesn't really matter to you might be the difference between that person staying or going. And so as community members, you have to start looking at that. Of what parts of this do you need? What parts of this do you want? What parts of this are just you doing the way you've always done it because you've never questioned it before? But could you do it another way? Can you be slightly uncomfortable for someone's feelings of safety?
Yeah. Which at some point also, if you do that regularly, those actions become normalized. So what today might be like, that's radical that we would have a safe space policy. At some point it might be like, yeah, of course you do. Like, people are interacting and we just want to make sure everybody understands what's the protocol, like what happens when. And that way everybody also feels empowered to act or respond or to participate, instead of feeling like, this is the first time we're having this conversation. It's like, all right, well, let's be uncomfortable, get better first, and then this will be normalized.
Yeah. And I think that's a important part of the discussion that often gets overlooked. And then people are like, why isn't any change happening? I was like, because you didn't actually change anything. And they're like, what do you mean? And it's like, well, you should hire different people. And they're like, well, if we hire different people, it's a risk. And I'm like, yes. Make sure it works. Like, that's your job. I don't know what to tell you, but that is the thing. Or, like coming back to kind of clothes and style, being like, well, vintage matters in comps. And it's like, does it have to?
Yeah.
Could you just like not care?
Decide it doesn't. Yeah.
And that's a decision that has to be made, because on one hand, people are like, well, I want people to look nice for competitions. And you can go down the question of like, well, why? Why does that matter? Why does that signal professionalism to you? What does professionalism mean? Does my hair count as professional? Like, what, where are the biases that come up there? But also, who are you missing because you're worried that I'm not in a suit?
Yeah. Yeah.
That you count me out because I won't wear a suit.
Yeah. Great. I love that you just brought that up, because I was just watching videos from a recent competition, and there was a routine that I saw and I really enjoyed. And I do remember my brain was like, I really wish they had dressed up more. And after I had like mentally acknowledged that, I was just like, I know, but would that have changed anything about their dancing?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe they would have been more uncomfortable if they were in different clothing, which is that they solved for their bodies to be comfortable so that they could move the best they could. In which case, it's like, actually, I would have I am enjoying the performance more because I'm watching them move freely and confidently, instead of being like, oh, I'm in clothing that like I'm not comfortable in. Like, this is not a part of my identity or how I want to express myself. But I noticed that like I also fall prey to that thinking of about just seeing types of clothing again and again. And even though I have also like had my own feelings about fashion in the Lindy Hop scene, I've still seen it so much that I know that my brain is like, that's the easy thing to know. Like, that person dressed in shiny clothing, they must be very professional. And it's just like, oh my God, you just have seen it so often that it's been normalized. Not that that's actually a choice that you wanted to make, that you want to stand for. Like, it slipped in, but it wasn't actually chosen. So like, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I think it was just yesterday that I was like, wow, okay, still have more to unpack. There's still more to be like, is that really something you want to hold on to? Like, is that serving you in the community? And if so, great. And if it's not, maybe consider.
And like, there will always be people who love vintage clothing and fashion. And there's that whole saying that I love from the vintage dress community, which is vintage style, not vintage values. And I support that. And I like love that for people. I know there are folks who love dressing in that way. I am not one of them. I tried. And I know that has been alienating to a lot of different folks. In particular, as just like an easy example of being at Focus, and then one of the black guys gets off work and he's like, am I allowed in here? And I'm like, yeah, you're allowed in here. And he's like, and I'm like, yeah, that's fine. Like, you're allowed to dance. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, then I guess Gray, as a little bit of a wrap up, I guess, what are some parting thoughts, or what are some things that you feel like it would be really great for people to highlight or like anchor into, or if you're like, actually, I got nothing like that, I want to say that I love my pin curls. Like, I like what is a parting thought that you feel like, okay, cool, like here's the close.
I think the close that I would give people is to think about the stories that you know and where they came from and who told you them and why.
Hmm.
Because just as a thing in the society right now, we're not great about looking at our own biases or the biases of the information that we get.
Mm.
And it is incredibly important to do so, in particular, uh, in looking at something historical. So, like, if you take a class with somebody, why did they teach you the thing that they're teaching you? Why did they go about it the way that they did? What are they bringing that you are absorbing as a student and you might not be realizing? And do you want to absorb that?
Yeah.
Because just because that's the way it's always been done doesn't mean it's the way it always has to be done, or even the only way to do the thing. And you may find that that doesn't actually work for you, or you don't actually agree with that value that's being taught to you or brought to you, or the myth that you're being told. Like, who does that serve?
Yeah.
And that can apply to dance or anything really. But I think that would be the thing I would think about and start thinking about. It's like, what is happening? Why were these teachers chosen? Why do we value vintage clothing? Why are classes structured in the way they are? Why do they always start on time?
I mean, it depends on what country you're in, but yes, I still think that's a very valid point.
But you know what I mean, though. Or even, why don't they start on time?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, what can you learn about those people and the things that they value and how that may or may not shape the dance, your dance? Do you want to value that more? Maybe you're having trouble being in the pocket, but if you don't understand how black time works, it's really hard to get it from a white perspective. It just really is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it sounds like stay curious, be curious, ask questions.
Ask questions, be curious, and
tip your bartender.
Tip your bartender. Don't accept just blanket statements of what everyone tells you is true. Question why or where it came from, I would say. And then find out if it's true. It could be. Sometimes it is. And that's honestly, that's the theme of the next piece, which is white bias and how it affects the scene. And how a lot of these things go unseen. Of like when Joe and I were talking earlier, and I was talking about how I'm still uncomfortable in the Lindy Hop scene, and we're like, like, yes, here, like, there are reasons why. It's very clear.
I mean, like, after you said it, I was like, this makes sense. But at the time, it was like, wait, what? But you're a teacher, Gray. Like, you should be told. Like, that's my experience that I'm projecting onto you. Like, I mean, that was very much one of those like mental slip ups of like, I mean, this happens even when you are, in the process, in the work, that it's still easy to be like, I'm sorry. Like, that was my projection. And thank you for the insight of like, actually.
Yes, I still am.
Yes, I am uncomfortable. Thanks for asking. I can't help but be white sometimes. Okay, so
and that's okay.
Oh, Gray, I love it. Gray, thank you so very much for your time and your emotional energy and the amount of effort you put into not only researching it, but to distill this in a way, even with it being such a long piece, to have distilled down so much information so that we, as a Lindy Hop community, and for anybody else that reads this, reads the article, has a sense on the divisions of stories, but also where they intersect and what like what are some of the like the really fun tidbits about like the history of the word jitterbug, which I recommend you read the article, and talk about the music and the intersection of it all. Like it was such an exciting thing to read, as it was also like, wow, okay, I didn't think about my history this way. I wouldn't have been able to say who spoke to me about the history of Lindy Hop. I just knew the general story. So like having been in the scene for as long as I have, I found it really shocking that I had not questioned more. So it was just a really amazing piece. And I strongly encourage everybody to read this if you're a part of the community, because at some point you will need to answer the question like, so tell me about Lindy Hop, or like, so what's the deal with this? And hopefully you're actually showcasing and sharing a story that is better researched than the like, I don't know, it was black and then there was a post office and now it's white.
Yes, and I know it's a very, very long piece, and there's a table of contents that
Yeah.
links to different parts of the piece. And to be fair, just to like disclaimer this, it is not, there is way more research to be done, not just by me, but by other people. And I do disclaimer that in the piece, I think a couple times. Um, it's a lot. It could be a like dissertation or a book even. So, but thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun to talk about this research. I really enjoyed doing it. Went way overboard, but I'm really excited about this story and became kind of obsessed with the
Yeah.
details in a good way. So I hope
Yeah.
people enjoy it, take their time with it, let it digest, and yeah, I think that's all I have.
Hell yeah. Well, until next time, everybody, read an article, do some wiggling, and don't be too narcissistic by that solo dancing. All right, everybody, have a good time, and we'll see you on the internet at some other point. Ooh, yeah.
Goodbye.